Hey everyone, my name is Jose, and here's my camera review of the Solana Mobile Saga. This is my first dedicated camera review of a phone, and I would like to try this sort of format. And although the Saga isn't really a camera phone at all, I still will be making dedicated camera reviews for all my future phone reviews, so might as well just start that process. Let's start with the specs, which unfortunately I do not have complete answers for. All I can really say is that we have a 23mm f1.8 50 megapixel wide with OIS, and f2.2 12 megapixel ultra wide no OIS, and a f2.4 16 megapixel selfie shooter. I would have liked to know additional information like sensor models, but that's okay for right now. Starting with daylight photos on the main sensor. Again, these photos surprised me because they do a fairly good job at being somewhat neutral in their style. The processing isn't stylistic as flagship tier phones do, which is what makes them distinct. So that means the Saga instead tries to be neutral, and it does an okay job at achieving this neutral style, and that certainly surprised me. Photos have pretty good saturation and good color rendition. I certainly like how clear sky environments are captured. It just seems natural with all the colors. However, I have noticed that where you have a lot of greenery, it does fail in accurately capturing those colors as they come out to be more yellow. It's not always like that, but it can happen. But white balance is actually very good at being neutral. I haven't seen a photo that is obviously warm or obviously cold, so keeping a neutral white balance is certainly a plus here. Sometimes a strong white balance is part of an OEM style, but since Awesome wanted to play it safe, then yeah, it does a good job at having an accurate white balance. Then we have dynamic range and HDR. This phone does a fair job at that. I have seen a few examples of clipping highlights, which I will get to later, but yeah, HDR is quite competent. But whenever I look at certain photos, I think they lack contrast as the photos are too bright and have boosted shadows. Like these photos are completely fine in this regard, but in other times, shadows are non-existent and these photos need higher levels of contrast because a bright look like this is not good. Also, the optics of the main sensor might not be that good. I'm talking about the actual lens and how it was made because I have seen multiple examples of lens flare across multiple photos, and out of all of my smartphone camera use, I have never experienced lens flare this frequently. So I don't think it's a coincidence, and I think the actual lens has a little bit lacking coating on it or whatever else is causing it. For portraits, bokeh segmentation is pretty good and will be enough for most people, but it seems like HDR never triggers because of these clipping highlights, and I did a comparison of a regular photo with auto HDR and a portrait mode photo. You can see that the floor has severe clipping highlights. Also, the bokeh segmentation didn't trigger at all, but besides that, portrait mode needs HDR to avoid stuff like this. You can digitally zoom in 8 times, and these photos are quite fair. The amount of detail you can get can be mixed with how far your subject is, and it kind of lacks sharpness for farther objects, but meets my expectations as zoom is a tricky thing for OEMs to tune. Then we move to the 12 megapixel ultra wide, and the biggest thing that surprised me is how consistent it looks with the main sensor. Like these comparison shots highlights how similar they are to each other, which is pretty good, especially because the ultrawide keeps parts of that neutral look from the main sensor. So yeah, that's good. This also means all of the main sensor's strengths and weaknesses are also the same for daylight photos. Color rendition is good in most scenes and looks the same as the main sensor, but again, becomes weird with certain scenes with greenery looking too yellow. But saturation is also a little bit lacking. It could use more of a punch so that it doesn't look that flat. White balance is the same, very neutral and very good because it's being safe by being accurate. HDR is slightly worse on the ultrawide than the main sensor, but remains very fair. Sometimes ultrawide photos are either more bright or more darker than the main sensor, but that isn't a problem, only really when it's too bright. This leads me to color fringing on the ultrawide sensor, which you can see in some situations, but this also surprised me because the Saga has pretty good mitigation against color fringing, whether that's an optics or processing thing. Color fringing is just way better managed than I thought it would be, and that's certainly a very good thing. Also, I don't know the focal length or FOV of the ultrawide sensor, but since it's 0.5x of the 23mm wide, then it's probably 12mm and focal length, and the FOV of it roughly looks like it's 116 degrees, which all of it is all pretty good, but it will be way better if Solana Mobile could just confirm these specs. Next, we have the 16 megapixel selfie, and selfies actually have a different style than the main sensor and ultrawide sensor, as these selfies have more contrast with darker shadows, which is certainly okay. And bokeh segmentation is very tricky here. Sometimes it works and sometimes it really fails, but most of the time it will fail. So I don't recommend using portrait selfie mode, as getting standardized non-bokeh selfies will be the better and safer option. There's also a cropped and uncropped selfie option, so you have the option for the focal length of selfies. I have no idea the focal length or FOV of the selfie camera, but that's fine. You have a wide option and a cropped option, which is certainly better than nothing. Moving to low light. Low light on the main sensor is very mixed. So outside, night mode looks fine, images are barely brighter with not much changes to dynamic range, but it certainly exposes the highlights very good as seen with the signs. Noise is also reduced, which is a good sign. These photos are fine, and I did get this weird artifact with night mode, so that might happen with your Saga too. However, using night mode indoors is where it starts to be more flawed. Not only are these photos just barely brighter than the standard photo, but the denoising algorithm is far too aggressive. If we zoom in, we can see that the noise is removed, but the algorithm made its photos way too soft that it removes details from photos. Look at this photo of this stormtrooper. It has marks because it has aged and whatnot, but the algorithm removed these details thinking it was noise, which is terrible. This also happens with Thanos, with many of his details being softened or removed with night mode, and this is the worst kind of night mode any phone could ever have. When we look at the ultra wide, photos are what I expected them to be, but at least highlights are better managed in night mode, but we also get like a vignetting effect, probably because it's exposing for the highlights. So that's weird, but everything here is still fair for an ultrawide sensor. Indoors, it's a similar story, just barely brighter photos and absolutely no levels of details. So don't rely on the ultrawide for low light photos, which I expected it to be like this, but still needed to put it to the test anyways. You can use night mode with the selfie camera, and these photos have the same weakness with using the night mode algorithm, and that is extreme softness with no levels of detail, so these photos are not that good. Video on the main sensor maxes out at 4K 60 FPS and is quite alright. Colors don't look bad, although the yellow effect is still here with the greenery. Dynamic range is quite fine, but not that good. Digitally zooming in is also fine, and it also maxes out at 8x with a good amount of detail. There's also video stabilization, which does indeed work, and I recommend this setting to be turned on for all the cameras, including ultrawide and selfie. Ultrawide video maxes out at 4K 60 FPS and is fine, but again, colors can be quite weird in some scenes, and I still recommend enabling video stabilization because what you get is a way more stable video, and there are no clear drawbacks in enabling this when it comes to how it affects dynamic range and whatever else. Selfie video maxes out at 1080p 60 FPS and is actually better than the main and ultra wide when it comes to color rendition, but besides that, it's quite fine for daylight scenes. So something we need to talk about is the audio quality you get from this phone when taking videos. So right now, it's pretty quiet. You can hear my voice, everything sounds fine, this is what we expected it to be. But I'm going to play sounds of rain through my speaker, and you're going to instantly hear how my voice is balanced well, but it's trying really, really hard to suppress the sounds playing through my speaker of rain. So I'm going to play it. It's a little bit louder than me, not too much, but you can definitely hear suppressing the audio, which I don't think it's a good feature. It does a good job, but I don't think it should really be this aggressive. I'm not going to talk for a little bit so you can hear the sound. And then I'm going to start talking. I probably sound really good. It's doing a really good job. But in a lot of situations like this, the suppression algorithm is just not going to be that good. Alright, just so we're on the same page, I'm on another device, the Poco X3 Pro. This phone, the Poco, does not have wind suppression or noise suppression for video, and I think a lot of phones are pretty much the same as the Poco, not having any levels of suppression. So I'm going to play the audio, and I think you'll instantly hear that audio sounds a lot more natural. You can hear a lot more details. So with it being on the Saga, the suppression on the Saga is just far too aggressive. Again, it's a good feature. I like it. I think it is quite impressive, but I don't think it should be on the Saga, because there's going to be a lot of moments where you're going to be outside or doing anything, and there's a likely chance that whatever audio you want to record, maybe of a concert or anything, the Saga's probably going to suppress it, thinking it's background audio, when in fact that's the audio you want to record. So yeah, good feature, but I don't think it's well implemented. You can also hear it in this video with the Koi. It does have an audio zoom feature, which is fine, but the audio is just really suppressed. It sounds so airy, and it's really bad and make the audio fiercely inaudible. Also, the video bitrate on the Saga is really high that it will eat up your storage quite fast. So a 10-second clip, 4K, 30 FPS on an average phone is around like 55 megabytes. If you could get down to 30, that would be even better, but let's just say 55 for right now. So that's a bitrate around 40,000 kilobits per second. It's very average. So what do you think it's on the Saga? Well, the same clip of 10 seconds, 4K, 30 FPS, it will be 75 megabytes. And that's because the video bitrate is around 65,000 kilobits per second, which I think is very, very, very high for any video recording, especially on a phone that's not a dedicated camera phone. I'm not really sure why you would want a bitrate that high. So if Awesome could tune it down to around 32,000 or 40,000 kilobits per second, that would seriously be much appreciated. And one last thing is the camera app. It's actually pretty good with its UI, but it has the bare essentials and nothing really too fun like panoramic mode or anything like that. What I really appreciate are these center markers and the grid and the leveler, which I use on all my phones, so very happy to see it here. You also get this feature where the photos you save don't have metadata, which is an okay feature, but you could always remove metadata using apps like Scrambled EXIF and a bunch of other apps like that. However, I do have a problem with these resolution toggles of HD, 2K, and 4K. So HD is 720p, 2K is 1080p, and 4K is, 4K at 2160p. The HD and 2K parts are the problem because I would have thought that HD is 1080p and 2K is 1440p, but it's not. Although this format is technically correct, mostly in Chinese markets, if it were up to me, I would have it display HD for 720p, FHD for 1080p, and UHD for 2160p, also known as 4K, just to keep it a little bit more concise. But overall, it's quite alright. So the camera app overall is actually quite adequate. It has the bare essentials, nothing fun like I said before, but at least it has those grid and center markers, which is probably the best feature and the feature I like the most on the Saga phone. So the Solana Mobile Saga, it's not a camera phone, it's not being marketed as a camera phone, so what we get here is quite average, especially since Awesome doesn't have the same levels as R&D as someone like Xiaomi, as an example, where Xiaomi can afford to put whatever levels of R&D into all of their phones, whether it's $250 all the way to their flagship $1,000 phones. So Awesome, with what they have put in the Solana Mobile Saga, is relatively good, and although it doesn't have that $1,000 flagship tier flair as you would get with any other camera phone around that price tag, since Awesome doesn't have those really high levels of R&D, well, you shouldn't really expect those levels of photo quality either. But again, it doesn't do a bad job at it. It's actually quite fine. I want to say daylight photos are maybe reminiscent of a $400 phone maximum, even though a $450 Pixel phone will be obviously miles ahead of the Saga phone because Google has that levels of R&D. But even so, it's pretty fine as it stands, and low light photos get kind of weird. I want to say maybe a $200 phone maximum, or even lower than that, because low light photos on this phone really confuse me and are quite strange. Speaking of that Pixel phone, you can make all of this phone's photos better that are reminiscent of that $450 Pixel phone, and all I did is install Gcam on this device. For those of you who don't know, Gcam is a modification of Google's official camera app ported from their Pixel phones, and it can make your photos way better on any phone you install it to, especially if you are not already satisfied with the quality of photos you get from your current phone. So on the main sensor, daylight photos are just much richer, and they greatly correct a lot of my criticisms, especially when it comes to color rendition and adding higher levels of contrast to photos, because the shadows are darkened instead of being boosted, and Gcam photos just have a better look and style to them. Dynamic range is greatly improved with less clipping highlights, and you actually get higher levels of details on Gcam with reduced noise, and you actually get better levels of zoom on Gcam with higher levels of details. So everything is looking good for Gcam right now. Ultra-wide sensors always benefit from Gcam more than the main sensor does, and these photos show you an even higher level of difference between stock versus Gcam photos, especially with greenery and the sky. These photos are just way better. Selfies on Gcam always look too HDR-like, but bokeh segmentation on Gcam is better for portraits, so that's something to consider. When it comes to video on Gcam, I don't see a difference in dynamic range or colors, but the bitrate is reduced to 40,000 kilobits per second, so that's the only real benefit. And I saved the best for last: stock versus Gcam for low light photos. And you might not see it right now, but Gcam is putting in work. Dynamic range, noise, contrast, and detail is improved. The only thing is exposure for highlights isn't optimized on this generalized version of Gcam. It has slightly lesser saturation, but that's an easy fix anyone can make. And this is just for the main sensor. Don't forget about the ultra-wide and selfie. Ultra-wide low-light photos have an even bigger difference. Everything I said about Gcam here stays true, except we actually get better exposure control and color rendition. And let's just take some time to appreciate these photos, because I'm sure most of the audience here is still new to Gcam, and I want you to be amazed about how we can get way better photos on the Saga or any other phone all through the enhanced processing from Google. And here's some lowlight selfies. The bigger difference is just reduced noise and enhanced details and very good HDR. I don't see too much of a difference with Gcam on the main camera in low light, so it seems pretty much the same. I think it's also the same thing with the ultra wide, just probably reduced noise, but maybe not too much. To conclude, what you saw with Gcam is what you can get on any other Android phone, not just exclusive to the Saga. So this is really good for any phone you purchase and you're not really satisfied with the camera results you get from your phone. Well, at least you could consider installing Gcam and see if it works for you. And for me, it definitely works on the Saga. And before anyone says anything about Gcam being an unofficial port, I have a short video coming out about how to safely install Gcam on any device. That short video is coming out on June 1st. And I say this because all of my shorts are on a planned schedule, and that's when that particular video is just coming out. So if you want to wait for it, that would be great. But yeah. And I think that concludes this video. My next video probably is going to be about a part 2 to my Saga review with additional commentary, more commentary, less of a review, but same thing. So I guess watch out for that, and I'll see you in my next video. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.